You think you know Empress Elisabeth of Austria, Sisi? The beautiful, tragic empress, obsessed with her looks, who captivated Europe. Well, buckle up, because the real Sisi was a woman haunted by a darker obsession, whose life was a bizarre dance with death, and whose end was so shockingly grotesque, history books conveniently gloss over it. This isn't your romanticized fairy tale dot, but first subscribe to the channel, because what we are going to tell you is incredible. We're about to peel back the layers of glamour and expose the shocking, bizarre, and utterly rotting truth about one of Europe's most enigmatic figures. From her extreme body obsession that bordered on the deranged, to the bizarre rituals she performed to preserve her fading beauty, to a death so sudden and strange it barely made sense. But here's the absolute kicker. Her own corpse, in its final journey, would deliver one last, horrifying shock that cemented her place as the empress who literally exploded in her coffin. You're about to discover the hidden horrors of Empress Sisi that make even the most dramatic royal sagas look like a tea party. Let's start with the most disturbing truth about Empress Elisabeth. By the end of her life, she was a walking skeleton, a ghost haunting the palaces of Europe, utterly consumed by a desperate, deranged obsession with her appearance. We're talking about a woman whose beauty became her prison, and whose efforts to preserve it led to a terrifying physical decay. Sisi's waist, even in her 60s, measured an impossible 19 inches. To achieve this, she underwent torturous daily routines, often cinching herself so tightly with wet leather corsets that servants had to physically pull the straps. This wasn't vanity. It was a form of self-annihilation. She often starved herself for days, surviving only on oranges, milk, or raw eggs. Imagine the most extreme modern diet and multiply it by 1,000, with no medical supervision. But the truly horrific part wasn't just the emaciation. Her teeth were said to be decaying from her restrictive diet, yet she refused to let dentists touch them, instead using strange, perfumed gargles. Her skin, once legendary, grew translucent and almost blue from lack of nourishment, yet she would slather it in raw veal, compresses overnight, believing it would keep her youthful. Her famous ankle-length hair, which took hours to style, was often falling out in clumps from malnutrition. Servants were reportedly paid extra just to endure the smell of her unwashed hair during its elaborate care routines. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but Sisi wore veils constantly, even indoors, to hide her fading looks and the visible signs of her self-imposed torment. She was obsessed with her measurements, carrying a tape measure and constantly checking her body, even punishing herself with extreme exercise if she gained an ounce. This wasn't a queen. This was a living ghost, slowly wasting away, obsessed with an image that no longer existed. The relentless pursuit of a tiny waist led to health issues far beyond mere thinness. Sisi's internal organs were constantly compressed, likely leading to digestive problems, fainting spells, and perpetual discomfort. Her intense lacing caused her to suffer from chronic coughing and shortness of breath, symptoms she largely ignored or attributed to other causes. The constant pressure on her ribs likely deformed them over time, further contorting her already fragile frame. She viewed any natural bodily function, especially aging, as a personal failure, leading to an escalating cycle of self-punishment. Meals, when she allowed herself to eat, were often consumed in secret or with meticulous scrutiny. If she ate a regular meal, she would follow it with punishing bouts of exercise, riding for hours until she was utterly exhausted, or performing rigorous gymnastics in her private gym. This wasn't about health. It was a desperate, almost masochistic attempt to defy nature itself. Her physical deterioration was also masked by elaborate fashion. While the public saw magnificent gowns, they often hid the reality of her increasingly gaunt body, her hunched posture from weak muscles, and the sallow complexion beneath heavy makeup. Her famous long hair, while still beautiful, was a constant source of agony. It took devoted hairdressers up to 3 hours daily to arrange, wash, and dry it. These women, primarily Franziska Pfeifferlich, became her confidants, privy to the gruesome reality of Sisi's fading health and increasing fragility. The sheer volume of her hair often caused her headaches, yet cutting it was unthinkable. It was another prison she willingly endured for the sake of her image. The contradiction was stark. A woman who craved freedom and abhorred court life was utterly enslaved by her own self-imposed standards of beauty. She was a tragic figure, yes, but tragic in a way far more disturbing than the romantic tales would have you believe. Her obsession became her downfall, turning her once radiant presence into a shadow, a precursor to the gruesome end that awaited her. She literally wasted away, turning herself into a fragile, almost ethereal being, utterly unprepared for the violent intrusion that would ultimately claim her life. Empress Sisi's life wasn't just about starvation. It was a bizarre tapestry of strange rituals, elaborate precautions, and a deep-seated paranoia that painted her as far more eccentric than tragic. She lived in a world of her own making, governed by rules only she understood, all designed to ward off the twin specters of aging and death. Her daily exercise routine was legendary and brutal. She had a personal gymnasium built in the Hofburg Palace, complete with rings, barbells, and ladders, a shocking sight for a 19th century empress. She would spend hours performing strenuous gymnastics, often until she collapsed from exhaustion. But here's where it gets truly weird. She would then immediately jump into an ice-cold bath, regardless of the season, believing it invigorated her. This wasn't health. It was self-flagellation, disguised as fitness. Her fear of weight gain bordered on the psychotic. Servants had to meticulously record everything she ate, as she often purged after meals. Her food was tasted by multiple attendants, not just for poison, but to ensure it met her exact, often impossible specifications. She carried a tiny, foldable scale with her on her travels to weigh herself several times a day. If the scale showed even a slight increase, she would embark on an even more brutal fasting regime. The palace kitchens were in a constant state of chaos, trying to cater to her mercurial appetite. You don't learn this in history classes, but Sisi was also deeply superstitious. She consulted mediums and spiritualists regularly, seeking guidance from the dead and trying to predict her own future. She believed in omens and would change her plans on a whim if she saw a bad sign. She carried good luck charms and avoided certain colors or numbers. Her fear of catching illnesses was so extreme that she traveled with her own cow to ensure a fresh, uncontaminated milk supply and brought her own personal pharmacist on every journey. This wasn't merely caution. It was a desperate attempt to control a world she felt was spiraling out of her grasp beyond her physical rituals. Sisi created an elaborate system of personal escape. She was a relentless traveler, constantly moving from one European destination to another, seemingly unable to stay in one place for long. This wasn't just wanderlust. It was a deliberate strategy to avoid the suffocating confines of court life and the constant scrutiny of public and private eyes. She abhorred formal ceremonies, official duties, and social gatherings, viewing them as a drain on her spirit. Her travels were meticulously planned, often with elaborate detours and sudden changes of itinerary to throw off anyone trying to follow or predict her movements. She even developed a complex code of signals in hand, gestures to communicate with her most trusted attendants, avoiding direct verbal commands that might be overheard or misinterpreted by others. Her staff lived in a state of constant readiness, often having to pack and unpack at a moment's notice as the Empress decided to depart for a new destination on a whim. Her aversion to human interaction grew more pronounced with age. She preferred the company of her dogs, horses, or simply her own solitude to that of people. When she did interact with others, she often did so with a large fan obscuring her face, specifically to avoid eye contact or to hide any expression she didn't wish to reveal. This fan became an extension of her reclusive persona, a portable barrier between herself and the world she wished to escape. Her refusal to be photographed or painted in her later years, preferring only earlier, idealized portraits to be circulated, further highlights her desperate desire to control her image and avoid the harsh reality of aging. She became a master of illusion, a living legend built on a carefully constructed facade of beauty and mystery. This wasn't just royal eccentricity. It was a profound psychological withdrawal, a retreat into a meticulously controlled bubble where she could dictate the terms of her existence, even as her physical health deteriorated. She lived in a perpetual state of flight, constantly seeking new environments to escape the anxieties and demands that plagued her. Her world was a carefully constructed prison of her own making, designed to keep out the perceived threats of age, illness, and the ever-present gaze of a public obsessed with her perfection. The rituals were her armor, her travels her escape. Routes, all part of a futile, yet intensely dramatic, battle against an inevitable fate. Despite her elaborate precautions and obsessive lifestyle, fate, in its cruelest form, found Empress Elisabeth. Her death was shockingly abrupt, a mundane walk by a lake turning into a bizarre, tragic, and lingering horror show that would precede the true grotesque end. On September 10, 1898, while walking along the promenade by Lake Geneva, Sisi, typically unaccompanied by heavy security, was suddenly attacked. An Italian anarchist named Luigi Lucchini, armed with a sharpened three-sided file, lunged at her. He aimed for her heart. The weapon, designed for maximum damage, pierced her chest. Here's the truly bizarre part. Sisi, with her corset so tightly laced, did not immediately realize she had been fatally wounded. The tightly cinched corset acted as a temporary plug, preventing immediate external bleeding and internal hemorrhage from being immediately apparent. She stumbled, stood back up, and, with the help of her lady-in-waiting, even continued walking for several minutes, believing she had merely been punched or shoved. She reportedly said, "What happened to me? And I don't think it's anything." It was only when she was helped onto a steamboat and her corset was loosened that the horror became apparent. Blood gushed from the wound, and she collapsed. Her last words, if any, are lost to the frantic confusion. The Empress, who had spent her life obsessing over her body, was now bleeding out, her life ebbing away from a single small puncture wound that had been masked by her own extreme vanity. Her death, so sudden and unceremonious, shocked Europe. But the truly gruesome details were yet to unfold. Her body, so meticulously preserved in life, was about to undergo a final, explosive indignity. The immediate aftermath of the attack was chaotic and marked by a profound misjudgment of the severity of her injury. Sisi, remarkably, walked nearly 100 meters after being stabbed, aided by her lady-in-waiting, Countess Sterre. A countess, initially believing it to be a simple assault, was focused on getting the Empress away from the perceived threat. Sisi's stoicism, perhaps a result of her high pain tolerance, cultivated through years of extreme diets and strenuous exercise, further masked the true extent of the damage. They boarded the steamship Genève, which was preparing to depart. It was only then, as the Countess began to unlace Sisi's infamous corset, a garment that had been her constant companion and tormentor throughout her adult life, that the reality of the situation became horrifyingly clear. The removal of the corset released the pressure that had, for precious minutes, been holding the internal bleeding at bay. As the restrictive garment came off, a dark stain of blood rapidly spread across her white chemise. Her breathing became labored, and she lost consciousness, collapsing onto a bench. The ship's captain, alerted to the crisis, immediately turned the vessel back to shore, an agonizing journey that felt like an eternity. Upon returning to the Hotel Beau Rivage, the scene was one of frantic desperation. Doctors were summoned, but it was already too late. The small, triangular wound, so deceptively insignificant on the surface, had penetrated directly into her heart, causing massive internal hemorrhage. The Empress, who had once been the epitome of vibrant beauty and vitality, now lay lifeless, a victim of an anarchist's blade, and, ironically, her own extreme dedication to a fashion trend that had inadvertently prolonged her consciousness after the fatal blow. The shock waves of her death reverberated across Europe, plunging royal courts into mourning and sparking outrage against anarchist movements. What few realized, however, was that the horror wasn't truly over. The Empress's body, already weakened by years of self-imposed austerity, was now set to embark on a journey that would reveal the ultimate, grotesque irony of her life, a final, undignified act of decay that no amount of obsessive care could ever prevent. This sudden, violent end, combined with her lifelong physical frailties, created the perfect storm for the macabre spectacle that was soon to follow. You'd think the tragic, sudden death of the beautiful Empress Sisi would be the end of her story. A somber period. You'd be wrong. Even in death, Elisabeth of Bavaria managed to deliver one final, absolutely horrifying spectacle that solidified her gruesome legacy. Her corpse, still in transit, literally exploded in its coffin. After her death in Geneva, Sisi's body had to be transported back to Vienna for burial in the imperial crypt. This was the late 19th century. Preservation techniques were rudimentary, especially for a body that had been stabbed and, crucially, had been subject to years of extreme malnutrition. Her body, already frail and thin, quickly began to decompose in the warm September air. Here's where it gets truly macabre. For the journey back to Vienna, Sisi's body was placed in a specially prepared, heavy lead-lined coffin. This type of coffin was sealed to prevent odors and leakage during transport. However, it also created a perfect, airtight chamber for the gases of decomposition to build up. As the days passed and the coffin made its solemn journey, the internal pressure from the accumulating gases became immense. And then it happened. During the long and arduous train journey, reportedly somewhere between the Swiss border and Vienna, the lead-lined coffin of Empress Elisabeth of Bavaria violently burst open. The gases, having nowhere else to go, exploded outward, ripping apart the seals and causing a horrifying rupture. The putrid stench of decomposing royal remains filled the train car, and the sight of the compromised coffin and its contents was so traumatic that the accompanying officials were reportedly sickened to their stomachs. The scene must have been ghastly. Imagine the shock, the horror, the frantic attempts to contain the mess and the smell, all while trying to maintain the dignity of a deceased empress. Servants and officials had to frantically work to reseal the coffin, trying to repair the damage, and contain the revolting reality of royal decay. This wasn't a quick pop. The force of the built-up gases was significant enough to tear through the metal lining, a testament to the powerful, unavoidable processes of putrefaction. The journey was already a somber one, with the imperial train carrying the remains of a beloved, if enigmatic, figure. This sudden, violent expulsion of gases transformed the solemn procession into a grotesque, horrifying incident that would be whispered about for years among those unfortunate enough to witness or learn of it. It underscored the absolute lack of control that even an empress, so obsessed with control in life, faced in the face of death's ultimate indignity. You don't learn this in history classes, but it was an incredibly grim and undignified end for a woman who had lived her entire life in a desperate quest for control, beauty, and perpetual youth. Her most final act was a complete loss of control, a grotesque rebellion of her own body against the confines of death. Even in the imperial crypt, it's rumored that for a time, a faint, lingering odor could be detected, a testament to the Empress who quite literally, spectacularly, burst forth from her final resting place. The lead coffin, while designed for preservation, inadvertently created a pressure cooker for decay. The delicate, emaciated body of the Empress, which she had so carefully maintained and starved, now became a vessel for a violent biological process completely beyond her will. This posthumous explosion served as a gruesome final punctuation mark to a life defined by extremes, a horrifying culmination of her struggle against nature. It was a stark, undeniable reminder that no amount of royal power, personal obsession, or aristocratic privilege could ultimately defy the universal, leveling force of biological decomposition. The beautiful Empress, who fled life's realities, could not escape the most basic and brutal reality of death.